we were excited when the opportunity presented for Alise Phillips to come and share with us. She is the Senior Compliance Manager at First Merchants Bank. And she works in all kinds of things, it sounds like, but fair banking practices, and has a presentation that she's offered to share with us today about appraisal discrimination. So kind of building off of that conversation we had, I don't know, maybe a month ago with Ms. Yvonne. Yeah, Alise, I'm just getting to know you more, but she's also a verse brat. She's also an IU Hoosier. We actually lived in the same dorm, not at the same time. I was cordially asked to leave Indiana University. She made it through. So an actual IU grad here today. So anyways, thank you, Alise, for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
I'll turn it over.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thanks to Nate and the Land Bank for having me to talk about this subject, which is one that is really close to my heart. As Nate said, one of my responsibilities as a compliance manager at First Merchants is fair and responsible banking, and this ties right into that. And it's really a topic that has gained a lot of traction recently. We've seen a lot more of it in the media, but it's been around for a very long time, and it's just sort of been something that people didn't really speak about. So I'm excited for the opportunity to talk about it. I'm excited that it's starting to get some attention, and hopefully starting to get some redress. And so we will just kind of jump right in. So first things first, let's see. I kind of just want to make sure to get us all on the same page. Let's just go over what the definition of appraisal discrimination is. And so this is when a home is undervalued because of the owner's race, ethnicity, religion, or another protected class. There are all kinds of reasons why a homeowner may have their home undervalued. But the type of discrimination that we're talking about is a lot more likely to occur in Black and Latino neighborhoods than in white neighborhoods. And we'll see a little bit more about that as we get into the presentation. And another term that you'll hear used throughout that you may not be familiar with, and so I just want to kind of give you just an idea of what that is whitewashing. So this idea of whitewashing means when a minority home buyer basically erases themselves from their home, right? They remove anything that might indicate that minority status. So that could be like paintings and artwork, pictures, books, anything that might indicate, that this is a minority that lives in the home. And sometimes people do this, and you'll see this. We're going to talk about a few case studies. Sometimes people will do this when they receive a valuation and they think, oh, this appraisal came back really low. Sometimes people will just proactively do it before they get their home appraised or before they place their home on the market. And so, just like I said, I want to start out with some case studies and just talk you through a few of these because I really think that helps us to see the impact and the scope of this issue. So this first one is one that I thought you might be familiar with. This is a story out of Indianapolis that made national news. This Black homeowner in Indianapolis, she wanted to refinance her home. And so she got a couple of appraisals. She went to a bank, and I should probably say the bank got a couple of appraisals. First one came back at $125,000. Second came back at $110,000. She thought that sounded really low. And so she suspected that her race could be a factor. So what she did was she went through and she did that practice of whitewashing her home. So she, and there's actually a video and there's several news interviews. And I kind of ripped this picture from one of them because she gets very emotional about having had to do that, right? But so she removed everything from her home that could indicate that she's a Black woman. And she also had a white male friend stand in for her when the appraiser came. The third appraisal then, after that, came back at $259,000, so more than double what she received the first two times. And she didn't change anything else, right, about the property. All she did was remove any indication that she was Black and she was absent herself. And I love this quote that I have up here, and I put some quotes up here. This one is not from the homeowner. This one is from Dr. Andre Perry, and I just think he's excellent. Him and his colleagues at the Brookings he is a senior fellow, they published a study, and it was one of the first really comprehensive studies about the devaluation of properties in Black neighborhoods. But I think that this quote is just very, very powerful. When a white person stands in for a Black owner, you're literally seeing the intrinsic value of whiteness being played out. In real terms, that's someone's college tuition, that is a business that should have been started, that is the resources to protect against the next pandemic. You're robbing people of opportunity. And I think that you'll continue to see that as we move through some of these slides here. So next we're going to move out to Oregon. On the left here, you can see this is Mike Kaiser and his husband. They are a same-sex couple, and they experienced appraisal discrimination. Mr. Kaiser actually claims that the appraiser made clear references to his disapproval of same-sex relationships during their appraisal. And then his home was significantly undervalued. You can see the first valuation was $625,000. Then they got another one from a different appraiser. It jumped up to $840,000 with, once again, no changes to the property. And he, in his quote, he calls out something that we'll, again, talk about a little bit later in this presentation, which is accountability, right, for the appraiser when this occurs. So I thought that was really good and worthwhile to point out that, once again, this is not just racial or ethnic minorities. It could be, any other number of things, including, same-sex relationships. So then moving to Jacksonville, Florida. This is an interracial couple, so white husband, Black wife, and they have a biracial child, and they had to also do that same practice of whitewashing their home, and the wife and child left the home during the appraisal, leaving the white husband by himself to get the appraisal, and theirs jumped from $330,000 to $465,000. And so, in addition to her quote on this slide here, and that's the actual homeowner's quote, but she has another quote that I pulled out of an article because I thought it was just a really good description of whitewashing. So she says, "We took down all family pictures containing Black relatives. We took down all pictures of African American greats that we displayed to inspire our son. Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison came down from the bookshelves. Shakespeare went up. My son and I took a convenient shopping trip during the appraisal, leaving my white male husband to show the appraiser around alone." And I think it's an excellent representation of whitewashing and just the impact it has on people that feel like they have to do that just in order to get the value from their home. And so next we're going on to California, and actually both of these are in Marin City, California, which is near San Francisco. And so you'll see that makes sense with those really high home values there. But this is, on the left here, this is Paul and Tanisha Austin, and they actually settled a lawsuit against their appraiser. And they're featured in this documentary called Lowballed, and I have a link to this documentary on my last slide. You can easily Google it, find it online. It's free to watch, of course, and it's really definitely worth the watch if you are interested and want to hear more stories and get more information. But it's kind of the same story. They wanted to refinance their home. They had it valued about a year before, and it came in at $1,450,000. And so the couple and their 3 kids were home during the appraisal, and the appraised value came back at $995,000. So they did the practice of whitewashing. They asked a white friend to sit in for them during the next appraisal, and that appraisal came back even higher than the one they had gotten the year before at $1,482,500. So I mean, $500,000 difference, right? And like I said, they settled a lawsuit against this, so they went against the appraiser directly. They settled this lawsuit against the appraiser, and they didn't release a lot of details about the settlement. That was kept confidential, but one detail that I thought was kind of funny, one detail that they did release was that one of the requirements under that settlement was that the appraiser watch the documentary Lowballed. But it really does speak to the need for a appraisers in that industry to have some education and perhaps some additional standards around this practice. And then on the other side, this is another couple, Black and Puerto Rican couple from Marin City once again. And when they heard the Austin story, when the Austins went public with their story, this other couple also came forward and said, hey, well, we experienced something very similar to this in the same city. So they, once again, they were trying to refinance. They had received a valuation prior, but when the bank went to get a appraisal, it came in $254,000 less than what they expected. And they're actually both real estate professionals. So Mr. Curtis and his wife, you can see their picture, with their daughter there. So actually, Mr. Curtis was studying to become an appraiser, and his wife also worked in the real estate industry, so they had access to some pools. So they pooled their own comps, and they also were able to go and look in detail at those comp properties that the appraiser used. And if you're not familiar with what a comp is, so when you're appraising a home, the appraiser is going to select similar homes, usually in the same neighborhood or hopefully in an area close by, and those are used to help determine the subject home's appraised value. And so they're referred to as comps, and so that's just another term that you'll hear me use a lot through this presentation. But when they looked at the comps that they pooled and the comps that the appraiser pooled, what they found was the comps that the appraiser pooled, a lot of them were homes that were in blighted condition. So they described homes with boarded up windows, a caved in garage, bricks holding up roof shingles, and that's not the condition their home was in, right? And so they believe that the appraiser deliberately pooled these properties that were in blighted condition in order to lower the value of their appraisal. Their story actually, you can see from their quote, that really upset them. And part of the reason for that is that their story is actually, I think, one of the saddest ones here, because they said that their bank, their lender, did not offer them a second appraisal until they reached out to the media. And the news reporter called the lender, and that's when the lender reached out to them and said, hey, do you want to get another appraisal? Unfortunately, by that time, the interest rates had gone up, and they could no longer afford to refinance the home. They ended up having to sell it and rent a home. And so it's something that they feel set them back, not even just within their lifetime, but you can see they have a young daughter here. They feel like this is something that is a setback that impacted them for generations. And they did file an extensive complaint with the California Board of Real Estate over this as well. And then lastly, so these are the last two kind of case studies that I have. So first in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, these are actually a couple of professors at Johns Hopkins University. And they had to whitewash their home to get nearly $300,000 of additional value. Now their story is a little bit unique to some of these other case studies because they live in a primarily white suburb of Baltimore. And so they believe that the appraiser really didn't feel like they genuinely belonged there when they got that first valuation. And so this just goes to show that not only does this occur in, majority, minority neighborhoods, but it also just occurs just on an individual basis to minority homeowners, no matter where they live. And then on the other side here, you may recognize this guy, D.L. Hughley. He's a famous comedian and actor. And I wanted to include this one. I'm sure he's not really hurting for the money probably, but I wanted to include this one because I just wanted to show that, fame and status don't seem to really weigh in here because he had the same experience. And he says that actually his realtor told him to take down anything that, and not a practice, by the way, that I would recommend for realtors, right? But his realtor advised him he maybe should take down anything that indicated that he was Black. And he said, he felt like he didn't need to do that. But then when the appraisal came back, he compared it to like what you would see for like a foreclosed property. And he said this was a property that he had maintained. He in fact had just remodeled it and done $125,000 of renovations. Now, the one thing that maybe his status did impact is that this is the one case where the bank actually identified on their own that, hey, this appraisal is way too low, and so his bank actually came to him and said, we'll give you a different appraisal. So he did have that going for him, but I always just think that's really interesting that that occurred with somebody that's, you know, so high profile. Okay, and so now we've kind of talked about sort of just some individual stories, and you could go out and Google search and find, you know, 100 more probably. But I want to talk about the collective impact that this has on Black and Brown communities. So I talked to you a little bit about Dr. Andre Perry and his fellow scholars that did this study. It's called The Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods, the Case of Residential Property. And it's all available online, all this data and information, and the entire report you can download and read for free. But there were some major things that they were able to conclude from their study. And I think it's definitely worth mentioning that a lot of times, you know, people will say, well, you know, those homes in those neighborhoods, they're valued lower because of crime or because of, you know, poor schools or less businesses. They controlled for all those factors in this study. So all those factors were controlled for, and still they found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%. So on an individual basis, about $48,000 average per home. And then also, when you look at that together, that's more than $156 billion in cumulative lost equity in the Black community. And so what would that do towards helping to eliminate the racial wealth gap, right? That's a staggering number. And then this is just what we talked about earlier, that they did control for crime, access to schools and businesses, walkability, all of those factors. And so this is, actually I took this directly from the Brookings Institute website. When they did their study, they looked at 113 metropolitan areas across the country. The pink dots on this map, they show areas where Black homes are devalued. So the bigger the dot, the greater the devaluation in comparison to similar white homes. You will also notice there's a few green dots here. They're kind of scattered throughout. That's actually the opposite. So that's actually where Black homes show an appreciative value over white homes, and once again, the bigger the dot, the greater the appreciation. But as you can see, there's a lot more cases, right, where homes are devalued. And one of those dots in Indiana, guess what, is Muncie. And so you can, and actually this is an interactive map if you go to their website, and so I probably spent like an hour and a half or 2 hours just looking at stuff on here. It's super fascinating, so if you get a chance to look at it, I certainly recommend it. But you can see, so in Muncie, we're not as high as the national average, but homes are devalued by about 11% or $7,000 per home. But if you look at our other cities in Indiana, they're significantly higher. Fort Wayne, the devaluation is about 17% for Black homes, so that's $18,000 per home. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Indianapolis. Fort Wayne is actually the highest. Black homes are devalued in Fort Wayne by 46%. And so it was a really large number. And so certainly in the state of Indiana, you don't see any green dots, and in my opinion, that means we have work to do here, as you can see across the country, right? And then just to call out some of the communities where Black homes actually have an appreciative value over similar homes in white neighborhoods, because I was curious, right, where are these places? So maybe one of the closest to us is Champaign, Illinois. Boston, Nashville was on the list, Ocala, Florida, Hilton Head, South Carolina, which was kind of surprising for me, Burlington, North Carolina, Monroe, Louisiana, and Wichita Falls, Texas. So in all of those places, and maybe we need to look at what's happening there, and why things seem to be different. But in those areas, that does not seem to be the case. And there's another study that Freddie Mac did just in 2021 now. So if you're not familiar with Freddie Mac, that's the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation. They are one of the government-sponsored entities that is tasked to kind of help ensure more sustainable and affordable mortgage funding in the United States. And so, as you might imagine, they have access to just a ton of data, right? And so they finally, after this issue's been raised, they finally decided to do a study. And so their study is just slightly different than what the Brookings Institute did. They actually looked at the percentage of appraisals that came back below contract price for Blacks and Latinos as compared to white home applicants. And as we all know, if your appraisal comes back lower than your sales price, you're not in a good spot, right? You either have to come up with some extra money or renegotiate the deal, and depending on the market, the seller may not want to renegotiate a deal. And it's the same thing with a refi. It impacts your refinance value, right? How much equity you're able to get out of your home. And so when they looked at this data, they had some key questions that they wanted to answer. So the first question is there an appraisal gap in minority neighborhoods? Short answer to that question, as you might guess, is yes. They found that appraisers' opinions of value are more likely to fall below the contract price in Black and Latino census tracts, and that the extent of the gap increases as the percentage of Black or Latino people in that census tract increases. And you can see that in this first chart here. So in neighborhoods where the population is 50 to 80% Latino in those census tracts, the gap versus white is 7.7%. When you look at neighborhoods that are 80 to 100% Latino, that increases to 9.4%. And you can see the same thing, of course, it's a little bit lower overall. The gap is a little bit lower overall for Black communities, but that kind of shows a little bit of what they found. Again, their study is available online to anybody that would like to go through all of this data. The Brookings Institute report, I will say, is a little bit more exciting, but there really is some good information in here, though. The second question they wanted to answer is there an appraisal gap for minority applicants? So just kind of what we were talking about before, we know it happens in minority neighborhoods, but does it happen on an individual basis to minority applicants regardless of where they reside? And again, short answer to this question is yes. Black and Latino applicants receive lower appraisal values than the contract price more often than white applicants. And you can see that here, happens 6.5% of the time for white applicants. For Latino applicants, that happens 9.5%, and Black, it happens 8.6% of the time. So some significant gaps there. And just like kind of what I showed you on maybe one of the very first slides, there's not as significant a gap for individuals as there is for neighborhoods, but there's definitely a problem, both ways, whether you're looking at it by the community or whether you're looking at it by an individual. And the last question that they asked is, are the appraisal gaps for minority tracts driven by only a small fraction of appraisers? And so they did an analysis of, appraisers and so they're looking at, one appraiser, and they're looking at kind of two decisions, right? One decision for a white neighborhood, one decision for a Black or Latino neighborhood. And so what they found was that a large portion of appraisers are generating statistically significant gaps between the two. And again, we're talking about homes and neighborhoods that are of similar value, right? And so I think, this just goes to show that it's not a problem that's, specific, and you could obviously see it on the map too, right? This is not a problem, it's just a small problem. It's a nationwide problem. It's happening throughout, and it's happening a lot of the time, so. And so the question that you may have then, the natural kind of next question is, what contributes to this gap? So the first thing, and we saw this in some of the case studies, the first thing could be individual appraiser bias, right? And one thing that's interesting, I think, to look at is the appraisal industry, right? Appraisers are largely white males. And you can kind of see I have this graph here. And so there's the nationwide number, and this is actually probably a little bit old, because I think the number of whites in the population is actually even a little lower now. but 86% of appraisers are white, and in our population, 61% of people, right? But it flip-flops when you go to your Black, Asian, and Hispanic Latino, where only 4% of appraisers are Black, whereas Blacks represent 12% of the population. For Hispanic Latino, that's a pretty significant gap there. What is that, 5% and 18%? So 5% of appraisers, but Hispanics represent 18% of our population. And so that probably also contributes, right, because it's not a very diverse industry. Also, 70% of appraisers are over the age of 50. So this is clearly not a profession that's gaining a lot of traction with younger people, and that's a little concerning too, right? So those are just some kind of things to think about. Also, there really is, we know that the fair banking laws and regulations, they apply to appraisers, right? So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act applies, the Fair Housing Act, these things apply to appraisers, but if you look at their own standards, there's really not a lot of clear guidance regarding discrimination. It just kind of says, like, don't do it, and then they move along. And so that could also be part of it, a lack of education, right? Maybe they all need to watch Lowball, but education and awareness and guidance for appraisers. And then also some observations from that Freddie Mac report. One thing that they observed is the comp distance is very different, right? So the average distance between a subject property and its comparables is substantially smaller when the property is in a Black or Latino census tract versus a white tract. So if they're valuing a white home, they're willing to go a little bit further to find a home that is really a good comp. Another thing is comp reconciliation. So they found that properties in Black and Latino tracts tend to be reconciled towards the lower end of the comp range. So there's a range, and they tend to go towards the lower end of that range if the home is in a Black or Latino census tract versus a white census tract. Now the dollarized impact there is small, and they pointed that out. But again, I should say, I guess, that it's small per transaction, because when you look at it on a whole, it makes a big difference, right? And then another thing that they recognized is that there is more variation in the sales price of comps used in appraisals for properties in Black and white, or in Black tracts versus white tracts. Now that actually doesn't hold true though for Latino tracts, but there is certainly more variation in the sales price of comps that are used for properties in Black tracts, and so that was another thing that they felt contributed to those gaps that they observed. And I think that the conversation about comps is really interesting because they can perpetuate this gap over time in the way that they're used. So you have to think about this, right? So appraiser A values a home, right? And let's say that appraiser A undervalues this home. And then what happens, right? That impacts the sales price, and so then when appraiser B comes along and uses that home, right, in their comp, then this just perpetuates. And based on the data from another study at Washington University, it looks like maybe it potentially grows that gap, right? It perpetuates that gap. And so you can see racial inequality in home values has actually been increasing since 1980. And the rate by which it is increasing has tripled in the last decade. So this isn't a problem that's like phasing out and going away. It seems to be getting worse and worse, which is certainly concerning with some of the gaps that we are currently seeing, for that to increase. The other thing, I would really be kind of remiss if I didn't talk about history when we're talking about reasons, right, for the appraisal gap and for appraisal discrimination. So I did a little research of my own and found that the first textbook on appraising property, so this is back in 1924, it pulled on popular eugenics and social Darwinism theories, and it basically suggested that land inhabited by minorities was just inherently less valuable, right, than white communities. And So if you're not familiar with, eugenics, I mean, it's this idea that you sort of engineer your society, right, to look how you want it to look. Probably the place that we've all heard about that the most is it's used in like Nazi Germany, right? And so those are the kind of theories that were pulled upon to come up with the first textbook on appraising property. And a lot of the things that were initially done appraising properties, they're still done today. Those practices are still done today. And so then a few years later, this is kind of funny, but a few years later in the 1930s, the federal government hired the author of that textbook, a man named Frederick Babcock, and he wrote the first federal underwriting manual. And so he further institutionalized those same theories, which you can see on anybody that's seen a redlining map right here, right? It's right there, and live and in color. What this does is it marks minority communities as hazardous, places where you should not or cannot make home loans, the only desirable places, the only places that received federal funding and subsidies to assist with the purchase of a home were the white communities. And so when you couple those two things together, unfortunately that is what gets us to where we are today. And of course, we had in 1968 the Fair Housing Act was enacted, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Community Reinvestment Act, all of those things happened. So the government is legislating, hey, we need to stop doing this. But what I would tell you is, and I love these regulations, right? Part of my job is to make sure that the bank follows these regulations. And they do help on a go-forward basis, right? They help on a go-forward basis. They tell you you can't do this anymore, but they don't help to redress the harm that was done all of those years before. That's what the laws can't, those laws are not designed to do that, and they don't. And so that is something that is kind of, up to us now to figure out how do we redress what's occurred and how do we help make that gap up. So kind of moving along to what is the recourse, if you know someone or if you yourself experience appraisal discrimination, what do you do? Working with a bank, obviously, and because I work at a bank, my first piece of advice is to let your lender know as soon as possible, right? Have that conversation. Lenders should have a process called reconsideration of value or something similar where they are able to handle these kind of complaints and, if warranted, get a new appraisal, right, for a customer. And I say contact your lender first because it's always better to as close as possible to when that discrimination occurs, right? To try to get this resolved, because otherwise, you saw in one of our case studies, it took too long, right? And they lost the opportunity. So that's, number one. You can also file a complaint. Like I said, Fair Housing Act applies to appraisers, applies to banks, right? If a bank has used that appraisal to provide you with a negative decision or an adverse action, as we call it, you can file a complaint with your regulators, and in fact, this over here, you can see the conciliation agreement information. JP Morgan Chase Bank had in 2021 a customer complaint to HUD, and HUD entered into a conciliation agreement with Chase. And these are the things Chase agreed to do. So Chase agreed to pay that black homeowner $50,000, provide their employees with additional training on how to handle that reconsideration of value process that I was just talking about. They reviewed their process to make sure that customers are appropriately informed and know that they have the ability to raise those concerns. And what they actually did was they changed their appraisal transmittal letter. And so this is the kind of like cover letter that goes on all their appraisals when when you're a customer and the bank sends you a copy of the appraisal. This is what would be on the front. And they revised that to include very specific guidance and tell a customer exactly what you need to do, who you need to contact if you feel like you've experienced discrimination or bias. And so those are some of the things that Chase agreed to do coming out of that agreement. And so this just goes to show you that filing these complaints, actually will do something. And of course, you can also seek help from fair housing advocates and agencies. The story that we talked about in Indianapolis, that Black homeowner reached out to the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana. They helped her to file complaints. Sometimes they'll get enough to file like a class action. And so those kind of organizations can be also great helps. And of course, we saw in at least one of these cases, a private lawsuit is also an option, right? Because there is a cause of action for a private lawsuit under some of these laws. And then, so the question that, if you're like me, the question that you probably have now is like, okay, that's great, that's what you can do if it happens, right? But how do we make sure that it doesn't happen? How can we stop it from ever happening? And so the good news is that with all the publicity around this, there actually has been a lot of action that's recently been taken. So in 2021, President Biden announced that they were launching an interagency initiative to combat bias in home appraisals, and so that's called PAVE, the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, which is a mouthful. It also includes 13 federal agencies. And so I can only imagine what those meetings are like, but the PAVE action plan really does have, I think, some really good ideas. Now it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out of a lot of this, but some of the things that they're talking about are the expanded use of alternatives to traditional appraisals, using value ranges instead of an exact amount as a means to try to reduce those gaps. And then also potentially using alternatives or modifications to that sales comp method, right? And they're trying to find something that may yield a more accurate and equitable valuation system. And then also public sharing of the aggregated historical appraisal data. They're saying let's release that data, right? To allow people to try to come up with different ways that may be more fair to appraise homes. And so those are some of the things. Also, in February of this year, the CFPB and other federal government leaders, they submitted a joint letter to the Appraisal Foundation. So the Appraisal Foundation is the private organization that sets the appraisal standards, and they urged the foundation to provide clear guidance on the already existing legal standards related to appraisal bias, right? All of this stuff is already built into laws, so all they're asking is that the Appraisal Foundation include clear guidance to appraisers around what we already have in place to try to help keep this from happening over and over again. And then also, I think it was in June, the federal banking regulators introduced proposed guidance for financial institutions on reconsiderations of values in residential real estate transactions. Now, this is just proposed guidance, which means that it's not final yet, and even when it is final, it's just going to be guidance, so it's not a requirement, it's more like a best practice. But I think the reason for them doing it this way is that it's much easier and faster to pass guidance, right? And so if and when this guidance is finalized, some of the things in there are just to sort of help banks to be advocates for their customers in these kind of situations. And so one of the things that the regulatory agencies point out, and this is very different for a regulatory agency to point this out, but they point out that you're not allowed, of course, because there's appraiser independence, right? You're not allowed to coerce or influence an appraiser's opinion or value. That's extremely illegal for banks to do, and I think we all know that we ran into trouble when that was happening before, right? But while you can't do that, what you are able to do is request that an appraiser consider additional appropriate property information, including information about comparable properties, to correct errors in the valuation. So you can't influence, but you can certainly ask, right? I think that's one reason that banks can be a little bit standoffish, right? They don't want to get in trouble, because they don't want to be seen to be trying to coerce the appraiser to give a higher value, which is in the bank's best interest as well. But that sometimes stops them from being a better advocate for a customer that's experiencing appraisal discrimination. The proposed guidance also encourages financial institutions to ensure that their reconsideration of value processes don't create unreasonable barriers or discourage customers from coming forward with a complaint or a request. So just kind of like what we saw with Chase, just putting it right there on their appraisal transmittal letter, right? Don't bury the lead, right? Don't make it unreasonably difficult for a customer to come to you with this concern. And on this next slide, this is some things that the Appraisal Institute is doing. So they are partnering with stakeholder organizations to attract more minorities, expanding their anti-bias and fair housing training. And they're also helping, this one I thought was an interesting one, they're helping to connect prospective appraisers with practitioners. Because one of the requirements to become an appraiser is that you have to apprentice under a licensed appraiser. And so they realize that could be more of a barrier since there aren't very many appraisers in minority communities. And so one of their things that they're doing is trying to create a program that will actually partner prospective appraisers with real practitioners to be able to get that real life experience. And also creating career pathways for aspiring appraisers to meet the many education and experience requirements, because it does take quite a bit to break into that industry. And so I think those are really good steps. And a lot of the stuff we've talked about, appraiser accountability is another thing. What happens to an appraiser when they do this? Is it a slap on the wrist? Is it something that will actually deter this from occurring in the future? And then my last slide is just some of the resources that I've kind of been talking about throughout. And I can certainly get this information to anybody that is interested. And of course, I'm happy to be a resource as much as I possibly can. So always feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, comments, conversation. It's a good profession, right? And as you can see, it's aging very quickly, and so it would be great to see more younger people, more minorities. It's something that you can train somebody up as a trade, right? And so also impact lives that way as well. So I love that. Yeah. Sure.
With probably most of us are working in a really localized context in Muncie, Delaware County, something like that. What are outside of I know you shared the results from the study I mentioned Muncie, but are there, I don't know if you can comment on your bank specifically, but are there instances where your bank or others are catching these lower appraisals and requesting another appraisal, or is that completely on the shoulders of the person who is selling the home?
Yeah, and that actually is certainly one of the things that is in that guidance that is proposed currently, and it's right now. I think it's going through the public comment period, so they're accepting comments from the public on this before they revise it and finalize it. But that's one of the things that they point out there too. the bank can be more proactive. You don't have to wait for the customer to make a complaint, right? And so I think, once again, that's one of those things that a lot of banks have been very standoffish about because of concerns with, being seen to be out of compliance with the appraiser independence regulations. But I think if we can get that guidance out there that yes, it's okay to do that, then you'll probably see more banks that will, maybe put those steps in there for them to be able to raise that concern on their own, kind of like what we saw in like D.L. Hughley's case, right? The bank said, that's not right. And a bank can do that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And so I think that is a really powerful way because, I don't know how many of you know, but I would say probably, I don't even know what percent, most of an appraiser's work probably comes from the banks, right? Banks are sending over, appraisals. And so I think the bank is in a more of a power position where, they can actually, when they request that from an appraiser, they may have, a better chance of getting a fair valuation than what a customer might have. And it's faster, right? So that the interest rates don't go up and you don't lose the deal. So I think that's really critically important. I don't know how many banks are doing that now, like I said, but I think this guidance would help.
I think what you're saying is 100% spot on. I see the issue, everyone is scared of appraisers because they think they're going to get in trouble, and they have very little to no accountability in regards to what they appraise stuff for, how they do it, their behavior. Like, it's very rare to see an appraiser cited for, like a grievance or something. And not that, I have appraisers that I'm friends with, like, I'm not saying they're horrible people, but we went from like, where there was like a lot of fraud to being so hands-off with the appraiser. Nobody can do anything about it. Appraisals come in low, that's what it is, so you better get them to come down in price, we're not closing. Like, that's, and there has to be a middle ground and common sense, and they have the reconsideration of values, and I've done those several times, and not necessarily, I'm not sure that any of those were like race related, but they never change it, because it's their opinion, right? And my opinion is this, and I don't want to use those comps, and it says, they're better comps or whatever they say, and the appraiser's like, well, that's not a better comp. It doesn't matter. They haven't been in the houses. The whole system is just messed up. That's what I said to Lindsay. I was like, the day that everyone just realizes that appraisals are really, someone's opinion, I don't want to say that they're like a joke, but they're just not, like, my buyers would be like, oh, well, it appraised for so much more, or, oh, it's low. Like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything.
It's very, very subjective.
Yeah.
Right? They're just not a lot. They have a wide choice of, the comps they can pick, and like you said, they don't, none of us probably like being criticized, right? But a lot of times, the bank will say, will you please reconsider the value? And we'll say no.
I think that, like, and of course none of us could change any of this, but I think when an appraisal comes in low, they should have to give justification for that. Write a paragraph, because I can't tell you the number of times I tell people, like, you understand you're ruining these people's lives. Like, this is their home, you are ruining this, and when you see the wealth gap and things like that, that is quantified, that is real. Like, you are causing these issues for these people. So you should put thought into that and think about how you're doing that. Yeah, you should think about what you're doing, but they don't see it as that.
Right. And I think more awareness would be helpful too for that reason as well. What is the impact of this practice? And another thing that they're looking at currently too is using AI, right, to do these valuations. Now that has its own issues, right? We all know. But and if you were to use AI and you were to input all of like this current data, unfortunately the AI would also be biased. So you would definitely have to control for that kind of thing. But that is something that is really being looked at. Go ahead.
Would it need anything to sit down and talk with the presidents of our local banks to say,
the bank has probably better results than like what an individual citizen might have, because of all the business that they're throwing at appraisers. But at the same time, they can and do say no to the bank all the time, right? So I think you need it, and I do think it takes the community, right, to come together, and you need multiple stakeholders, including your banks, your financial institutions, your appraisers. We need realtors. We need, our fair housing advocates in the community, those organizations. We need organizations like the Land Bank. We need people to come together and come up with really creative solutions. You know, if we wait for these 13 federal agencies, you know how long it takes one federal agency to get something done. If we wait for these 13 federal agencies to agree and take action, then that's gonna take a really long time if it ever happens. And so I really do think it falls on us, in the community to figure it out.
Is there any economic incentive for anybody to appraise lower? Not that there has to be economic justification or economic influence into this, but is there?
Yeah, I've never really thought about whether there is any, economic advantage to this for anyone. And really, honestly, not that I know.
No.
Nate, can I?
But maybe I was gonna say something else right after you.
So when the market changed and home prices went up and everybody was like, yay, mostly property owners, my house is one, or if you were getting ready to sell your house, that's great. But Rebecca knows on the other end of that is our realtor, like there was a panic inside. Like I always want our home buyers, when we build a neighborhood, we have to go out and we've had to tell the appraisers about comps, because it's like there are no comps. I'm like, yeah, we just built a house, some of it was our fault, because we learned over the years, like, we weren't using a realtor, we would build and sell a house sometimes, and it wouldn't be on the MLS, so it didn't get, So we've learned, like, if you're giving somebody homebuyer assistance, you still sell the house for what it's worth, and you give them the assistance, you don't mark the price of the house down, because that affects value when it gets, So we've really learned over the years about comparing. Home appraisal can be a double-edged sword, I think, because when the market went crazy and homes were appraising for more, like, I'm gonna sell a house in Anderson for higher than any house I've ever sold. And it's like 127 or something like that. I worry about 80% AMI people being able to afford that. It's still under the FHA limits and stuff, but it's a double-edged sword a little bit, because like, the more it appraises for, you worry about, low income families being able to afford it. But, you also want them to realize the full valuation of whatever they're getting, right? And for them to be able to turn around and sell it. So,
I've had multiple appraisers say to me, I'm not gonna go to jail. Like with an appraisal, it's low, I'm not gonna go to jail. Like, no one's asking you to go to jail. We're asking to use the comparables that are there. And so I think that they're like scared. Has anybody ever said that to you? Like, they're scared to, I don't know. I don't understand. I'm like, well, if you know how to do your job correctly, because right here it says it's your opinion. If you can back up your opinion with factual data, I don't see how you're going to jail.
See, I don't get to talk to appraisers though.
Yeah.
I can't.
I don't know. They act like it's, so I think they want to certain ones want to stay here, where the values are here. They want to be here so that they're under the radar. They don't want to be this person, they just want to be middle of the road so they're getting their job done and whatever. So it's not really an economic impact, but I guess if you went to jail, it would economically affect you, but no one's asking you to commit fraud.
Right, no one's asking anyone to overvalue,
Right.
right? We're asking for the value to be equitable, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, exactly, so that's why I was, I don't know that there's any, I don't think it is any harm to white communities, right, to value, properties in Black and brown communities fairly. Yeah.
Another question is, maybe you already answered this, but, is it publicly accessible information? Who what they're pricing at?
I don't think that's publicly, I mean, you know, there
It's
is
not organized.
some publicly available information like, aggregate, like HMDA data. So like Home Mortgage, Disclosure Act, you know, information, that like, you know, banks release, and they release those aggregate figures. But I don't think, I'm not aware of any place where you can, does anyone know if you can look up like any, I don't think there's any public place to look that up. I think that's one of the ideas that PAVE group had, was to release that aggregate data, so
Yeah.
people could actually access it and use it in that way. You know, banks definitely have access to it, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I could go in the bank and pull a field of like just like what Freddie Mac did, right? The appraised value versus the sales price, you know, of a home, but I don't know that that's really the public.
Yeah.
And that could be part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
It's all kept very private. Alright. Well, if no other questions or comments, again, thank you guys.
Yeah,
I
once
really,
again,
really appreciate
thank
it.
Yeah, thank you. That was fantastic. Really, really great. Really great.
I really enjoyed talking.
Okay.
So it's fun.
Yeah, and obviously, I failed to mention that she's a lawyer, and it kind of comes through when you're presenting.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, I just
Or
went
you're-
on TV.
you're
I graduated from law school, I'm not bar certified,
Sorry.
and so I always say I'm not a lawyer, I just play one on TV and I have a good time with it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's great. I was, trying to make a connection with land bank stuff. I feel like, the cumulative effect that, kind of Alise talked about, over time, how appraisals kind of can have an exponential effect on where we are presently. And so that conversation about how you repair what's already happened is really, it's complicated and hard, but it's a serious part of understanding the issue and potentially talking about a solution. And I feel like the land bank, we're kind of on the other side. We're dealing with the symptoms to a degree, after neighborhoods have devalued and there's blight, we're one of the kind of organizations that come in after the fact. But yeah, that's really powerful. The kind of over time, you put what was happening historically and the thing, makes perfect sense. How there's a real gap that's over time. It was $156 billion. That's a lot of wealth. And it's like investing in the stock market over time. It gets massive. Yeah. So thank you, Alise. Great. And I feel like sometimes the conversations we have directly connect with land bank. Sometimes it's more few steps to get there. But I think also just this space is, again, not the only space, but this is a space where I think having these conversations about these kinds of issues is really, really important. Just basic education about the reality of a situation is like the first step, obviously. So thanks again. Two things I failed to mention at the beginning. We had some new people, and you always have to introduce yourself if you're new. This is your first time. So new people, would you please introduce yourselves?
Hi there, I'm Alise Phillips. I'm working at Prime Trust currently, and I'm gonna graduate from Ball State this upcoming fall semester. So, and I'm also part of the Casa Academy over there. So if you guys ever stop by there, you might see me there on the weekends. Part-time waiter therapist over there.
Welcome.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Patrick Donahue. I work at the Boys and Girls Club of Muncie. I'm the annual giving officer there. Just trying to integrate myself in the community more. Just find places that I can have an impact, and that places that also impact our families that we serve.